Thank you very much, Daniel. You know, he said that I had Paul Krugman as a professor. That probably explains why I hated macroeconomics and retreated to microeconomics for the rest of my concentration in that field at MIT. You know, I come to you from Kentucky today, where we are still clinging, obviously, to our guns and religion, if you've seen the election results. In fact, a lot of times in Kentucky, we mix politics and guns in a good way. I was at a fundraiser for the Kentucky State House, and this involved teams of 4 shooting shotguns at sporting clays. And I thought, well, you know, I don't spend as much time with my kids as I'd like, so I brought my sons to be on our shooting team. And so it was a bunch of politicians and lobbyists in golf carts going around shooting at sporting clays. Well, my 12-year-old son had this small gun. It was a little 20 gauge we got him for Christmas. And I thought, well, it'd just be kind of nice to include him. Well, after 3 rounds of sporting clays, 3 different stations, he was shooting them. He couldn't even miss. He was doing so well. And I was so proud of my son's performance at this shooting match, at this fundraiser, that I texted my wife and I said, Justin is out shooting lobbyists and politicians. I neglected to think about how that might read. And she texted me back immediately and said, OMG, I hope not like Dick Cheney. So anyways, if you know, it's hard to speak today and not talk about the election results, but I want to talk about something peculiar or particular that happened in Kentucky. 17 incumbent Democrats lost their seats in the State House. We went from a Republican minority to a Republican supermajority in one night. And you know, so what you saw at the national level, which is the Democrats basically abandoned their base of working class, middle class, blue collar voters, we saw in Kentucky. But I think the Democrats also abandoned another portion of their base, and it cost them dearly in this election. And that's the people who are against the next war already. You know, it was interesting in this election cycle that you had Hillary Clinton was the pro-war candidate and Donald Trump was the pro-peace candidate. And a lot of people say, well, you know, Trump wasn't my first pick, he was more like my 17th pick in the primary. Well, I'll tell you, he wasn't my 17th pick. He was closer to the top because there were really only 2 candidates who were in favor of not going into another war immediately, and that seemed to be Senator Rand Paul, who was my first pick, and Donald Trump was near the top. But again, Democrats abandoned that broad swath of what has made up their base, and I think it hurt them in this election. I want to talk to you about some things that have happened recently in Congress. That's perhaps the perspective that I can bring today. One of those is 2 months ago, we had a resolution come to the floor in Congress. And it's frightening how many of these resolutions come to the floor in Congress. Oftentimes under a suspension of the rules. A lot of times they'll pass by a voice vote with hardly anybody on the floor. Well, this time we got a recorded vote, and it was on a resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives to support the territorial integrity of Georgia. Now, our first notion was if we let Georgia do this, South Carolina would be next, and things would just get out of hand. But after studying the bill, this was actually a poke in the eye of the Russians, is what this bill was all about. In my opinion, some of the resolve clauses, for instance, condemned Russia's activity there in Georgia, demanded their immediate withdrawal from Ossetia, and urged the U.S. to participate in joint military training with Georgia, and urged their advancement toward Euro-Atlantic integration. Can you say NATO? So we have been really pushing or provoking, in my opinion, the Russians there for many years. Before the conflict broke out in Georgia, we were trying to pull them into NATO. And if you look at a map, it's a real stretch to say that Georgia is in Europe, okay? But that's in fact what we were doing, and you see this as a theme, I think, in other areas in and around Russia. So there was a vote on this, and the vote was 410 to 6. There were only 6 of us who objected to trying to provoke Russia. or to throw dirt in their face, if you will. And those folks were Jimmy Duncan, who was your speaker last year, who gave the opening remarks. I have tremendous respect for him. He's the only Republican in Congress who's still in Congress that voted against the Iraq War. But he's seen this before, and so he was a no vote. There was Walter Jones, who I describe as a libertarian-leaning populist. There was myself, who I describe as a libertarian-leaning Republican. There was Justin Amash. I describe him as a libertarian-leaning libertarian. And also Chairman Lamar Smith was with us on that vote that day. But there were no Democrats, which is interesting. So again, I think there's a spot in the Republican Party for those of us who don't want to intervene in everybody's business or provoke or escalate things that aren't in our national interests. And it's going to be ours. This is going to be our political territory, I think, if we keep this up in Congress and claim this space. And I think it's a space that all fiscal conservatives should want to be in. Because if you think about the cost of war, there's a recent study that shows that the cost of war in Afghanistan and Iraq is have committed or will commit to $5 trillion because of those wars. That's a big chunk of change. I mean, if you look at it's a quarter of our national debt is attributable to that alone, if you will. And under even the rosiest assumptions, let's say we could keep borrowing money from the Chinese at 1%. And let's assume, which I think this is a pretty good assumption, we're not going to do anything to pay down the principal on the national debt because the principal is still going up. But let's assume you could borrow the $5 trillion at 1%. That's $50 billion a year forever. Okay. I serve on the Transportation Committee, and I can tell you that $50 billion is in fact the entire amount of our highway trust fund that we spend annually. That's all of the gasoline tax in all of the United States, and then some. And that's all we spend on our infrastructure. So if you think about that, just the interest alone on financing the war activity in the Middle East would consume our transportation infrastructure spending. Or another way to look at it is, if we hadn't engaged in so much of that, we could have doubled our infrastructure spending forever, in perpetuity, because I'm just talking about 1% interest on $5 trillion is $50 billion. Let me focus a little bit on one particular aspect of that spending that we got into, or we studied in one of my other committees, which is the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. If you haven't read some of the reports from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, please do. His name is John Sopko, and he's really doing what an Inspector General should do, which is to blow the whistle on waste, fraud, and abuse. And trust me, there's plenty of it in Afghan reconstruction spending alone. We spent $113 billion rebuilding that country. I'm not talking about the military spending there. I'm talking about the nation building, if you will, that we've engaged in. $113 billion. Again, let's put that in perspective. Our entire infrastructure spending in the United States at the federal level is $50 billion. So you could have, for what we've spent in Afghanistan, you could double the spending in the United States on infrastructure for 2 years. But drilling down even further into that $113 billion, when I had a chance to question the Deputy Secretary of Defense for that region about the spending, I chose to ask about the $8 billion that we spent on counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan alone. $8 billion. So before we started trying to eradicate poppy production in Afghanistan, they were producing quite a bit of it. But after 12 or 13 years of trying to eradicate it, they've now doubled production. So, and that cost us $8 billion. And so I asked the Deputy Secretary of Defense for that region, is there any year in which their production of poppy and therefore opium went down? And she said, in fact, there was one year. And she mentioned the year, and then one of those people that sits behind them in the hearings to keep them out of legal trouble leaned forward and whispered in her ear, and she said, well, there was a drought that year. So that's the only year that we've been successful in diminishing their production of opium was in a year that they had a drought. And so we spent $8 billion there. I asked the Inspector General, I said, you know, I'm from Kentucky and we do a lot of farming there, and there's this stuff called Roundup. Could you spray that on these plants? Would that work? And he said, in fact, it would work. It responds to herbicides, and you can see where all the fields are. They've got bright orange flowers, and they show up on all the pictures we have of the country. You know exactly where they are. And when I asked him why we don't do that, he more or less told me because it would be too effective. Now think about that. I mean, what he was trying to tell me is the ramifications of reducing that much of the Taliban's income overnight would cause another war to break out in Afghanistan. And so that's the dirty little secret, is maybe we aren't trying to do what we say we're trying to do over there. Maybe we're just spending money over there, and we need to resolve some of this before we spend more money. In fact, the hydroelectric dam that we built over there, it's fairly well known now that we give a third of the electricity to the Taliban. Maybe you wondered why they quit trying to blow it up. It's because it produces electricity for them now. And so I think we need to stop trying to nation build in Afghanistan. In fact, I offered an amendment this summer on the appropriations bill to cancel out all of the spending on the war on drugs in Afghanistan. I thought it might get 10 votes. I was happy to see that it got 63 votes. And if I get another opportunity, I'll just keep offering that until hopefully reason prevails. But we've got a marker now in the sand. Let's see. Speaking of markers in the sand, I want to give you a little bit of good news. And this has to do with the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branch. The bad news is that we haven't had an authorization use of military force, or more appropriately, a declaration of war, since 2002. So for 15 years, we've been engaged in military conflicts around the globe that the executive branch has unilaterally gotten us into. So Walter Jones, Congressman Jones from North Carolina, is a leader on this, and I've been part of this battle for trying to get a debate in the House of Representatives to exercise our constitutional obligation to declare a war in the places where we are engaged in war, even if it's a small war. And we've yet, as of yet, been unsuccessful in doing that. Speaker Boehner denied us that vote, or debate even, and so has Paul Ryan so far. But we're still pushing for that. But the bit of good news that I wanted to share with you is that in 2013, if you'll remember, it was about August of 2013, Secretary Kerry and President Obama had said that Assad had crossed the red line, that he had used weapons, that he had used chemical weapons, and that we needed to go to war in Syria. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember it because in June, just a few months before that, I had introduced a bill called the War Powers Protection Act of 2013. So I introduced this bill with about a dozen co-sponsors to prevent spending for military or paramilitary activities in Syria without a declaration of war. And of course, this pretty much went nowhere in the committee, but I thought, again, it was important to mark this spot in history and try to get a discussion and a debate on this in Congress. Well, the president, for once, said, you know what, I'm going to go to Congress, and I'm going to get an authorization to go to war in Syria. He probably only sought a use of military force. It should have been a declaration of war, but nonetheless, I give him credit. He said he was going to go to Congress in 2013, August of 2013, to get this vote. And it was, for a while, somewhat terrifying because Speaker Boehner said, yes, we're with you. We need to go to war in Syria. And Speaker Pelosi said the same thing. In fact, there was no resistance from our congressional leadership to going to war in Syria in 2013. By the way, I'm talking about a war with Assad. This is pre-ISIS, right? And by the way, this is still what they want to do. They want to go to war with Assad, not with ISIS. So the president said, well, let's go to Congress and get a vote. And what ensued, I had not seen the the likes of until then, and I've not seen the likes of since then. My office typically gets 3 to 10 phone calls a day on various things. Impeach the president, support this, don't support this, whatever. I got 100 phone calls a day for 7 days in a row. And they were 99 to 1 each day. Do not go to war in Syria. Now, when we start getting phone calls of more than 10 a day, we start trying to figure out where they're coming from. Who's stirring this up? But, are they reading the script? What is it? There was nobody stirring this up. This was the American people tired of war, not wanting to go into another war, looking suspiciously at an administration and, frankly, some Republicans who said, we're going to align ourselves with moderate rebels over there. And so the pushback was genuine. And it was so great, and this was not really on the news, but I'll share a conversation that's indicative of what was going on in the House. It was so great that Congress was feeling all this pressure. The phone lines were melting. We've never gotten calls of this magnitude since then, since 2013. And I went to one of my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, which is notoriously anti-war, thankfully, and I asked him, are you really going to vote for the president's war in Syria? Because at that time, they hadn't spoken out against the president. And he told me, he said, I'm just trying to be kind to my president, but if this comes to a vote, there is no way any of us are voting for this war. And so that gave me the confidence that if it did come to a vote, it would fail. And what ultimately happened, if you remember, we didn't go to war in Syria. And the reason we didn't go to war is the president, for once, respected Congress's exclusive authority to decide that. And Congress received the pushback. The House of the People, which is elected every 2 years, frankly, everybody is up for election every 2 years, felt the pressure. And when they realized the vote was going to fail, they never had the vote. So that's the great news, and that's the good news about something good that happened. The final comment that I wanted to make about something in Congress, and this applies to the presidential race, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. This also has implications for the Republican Party going forward. One of the implications, I believe, of this election is a shift in the platform, the Republican platform. And there's a religion in the Republican Party that's now been questioned, which has never been questioned since I've been in Congress. And I think it's a refreshing thing that it's being questioned. I'm not talking about Judeo-Christian values or any particular religion you might go to church for. I'm talking about the sacred cow that's known as free trade, the one that ye shall not question. And because let me tell you my experience in Congress. Again, sadly, this is not a good experience, but most of my experience in Congress are not. This was a year ago. We were told that the World Trade Organization had issued a ruling and that Congress had to comply immediately. All of our appeals to this World Trade Organization had been exhausted. Appeal after appeal had fallen on deaf ears. And now Congress had to act because the World Trade Organization said so. The court that's set up to govern all of these multilateral trade agreements said that we were in violation of a trade agreement. What was our violation? We required labeling of the country of origin for beef and pork. That was the violation. They said that was protectionist. Now, and by the way, this issue has broad ramifications because right now, your car is labeled, your clothes are labeled, your smartphone is labeled country of origin, your tools are labeled. Virtually everything you buy has a country of origin labeling. And I think that's appropriate. Outside of this country, they operate under different laws, different morals, different standards of safety. And so I think it's an appropriate disclaimer to know where those products come from. And it's an appropriate federal engagement to require that when it comes into our country. But what had happened is when you bring a cow or a pig into the country and feed it, you have to keep it separate from the domestic animals if you're going to label it later on. And so they argued that, this causes an undue burden on imported products, and so the country of origin label must be removed. And what did Congress do when the World Trade Organization said jump? Congress said, how high shall we jump? And so it passed on a vote. There were just a few of us Republicans and a few Democrats that opposed it. The comparable bill in the Senate did not pass, but as they're often wont to do, they just threw it into the omnibus last December. And so they repealed the mandatory country of origin labeling for beef and pork. And at the time when I fought against this, and I pointed out this is an extra constitutional, in other words, beyond the Constitution, court that had made this decision that we shouldn't be bound to. By the way, I went and looked up, I thought, is this because of NAFTA? It's actually because of the GATT that was passed in the 90s. It goes all the way back to GATT. And so when President-elect Trump says we've made bad deals, he might be right if we've made deals that require Congress to change our food safety laws based on some court that's not appointed or confirmed by our Senate. But anyways, when I posed this, I was labeled a heretic within the Republican Party. Oh my gosh, you must be a protectionist if you want to label, if you want to put labels on the food. And so, anyways, I think it's refreshing. I think we're going to take a new look at things like that. I think we can start to have a rational discussion about trade, talk more about bilateral agreements, don't require a judicial body at a global scale. And I'm looking forward to that and challenging some of the assumptions, not just in foreign policy, but also in trade in the Republican Party. And I want to thank George O'Neill and Daniel McCarthy for inviting me here today, and also to all of you for listening. Thank you.